Lisa Rodriguez had always been the practical one in her family. At 32, she worked as an accountant in downtown Phoenix, lived in a small apartment, and had never owned anything more valuable than her 10-year-old Honda. So when the lawyer called about her great-uncle Frank's will, she almost hung up thinking it was a scam. "Ma'am, I'm calling about Franklin Rodriguez's estate. You've inherited his property in Millbrook County," the lawyer said in a tired voice that suggested he'd made this call 100 times before. Lisa barely remembered Uncle Frank. He was her grandmother's brother, a quiet man who showed up to family gatherings maybe twice in her lifetime. She knew he lived somewhere out in the country, but that was about it. Her grandmother had mentioned once that Frank never married and kept to himself on his old farm. "What kind of property?" Lisa asked, already calculating the headaches this might bring. 47 acres of farmland, plus a house and some outbuildings. "It's been in your family since the 1940s. Lisa nearly dropped her phone. 47 acres? She'd never owned anything bigger than a parking space. The lawyer explained that Uncle Frank had passed away 3 months earlier, and after going through all the legal steps, they'd finally tracked down his only living relative. That was her. 2 weeks later, Lisa drove the 3 hours from Phoenix to see what she'd inherited. The GPS led her down increasingly narrow roads until she was driving on what could barely be called pavement. When she finally found the property, her heart sank a little. The farmhouse looked like it hadn't been painted since the Carter administration. White paint peeled off the wooden siding in long strips, and the front porch sagged like a tired old man. The barn behind it was missing half its roof, and weeds had taken over what used to be a garden. Rusted farm equipment sat scattered around like metal sculptures that no one wanted. But as Lisa walked the property line, something started to shift in her chest. The land itself was beautiful. Rolling hills stretched out toward distant mountains, and old oak trees provided perfect shade spots. She could imagine cattle grazing here, or maybe horses. There was even a small creek running along the back edge of the property. What Lisa didn't know was that everything around her great-uncle's farm had changed dramatically over the past 15 years. When Frank first bought this land, it was surrounded by other farms and empty countryside. But developers had quietly bought up most of the surrounding area, turning it into something called Millbrook Estates. Millbrook Estates wasn't just any housing development. These were expensive homes, the kind with 3-car garages and swimming pools, where people drove luxury cars and worried about property values. The whole community was run by a homeowners association that had very specific ideas about how things should look and what belonged in their neighborhood. As Lisa explored the old farmhouse, she had no idea that just beyond the tree line, Richard Blackwood was standing on his back deck with a pair of binoculars. Richard was the president of the Millbrook Estates HOA, and he'd been watching Frank's property for months, waiting for exactly this moment. Richard was the kind of man who wore polo shirts every day and treated the HOA presidency like he was running a small country. In his mind, Frank's rundown farm was an eyesore that brought down everyone's property values, but more than that, Richard had bigger plans for that land. "Honey, is that the new owner?" Richard's wife Patricia asked, joining him on the deck. "Must be. Some young woman from the city by the looks of it," Richard replied, lowering his binoculars. This could actually work out perfectly. Patricia knew that tone. Her husband was scheming again. "What are you thinking?" "Well, she clearly doesn't know anything about farming. Look at her. She's wearing office clothes to walk around a farm. She'll probably want to sell as soon as she realizes what a money pit that place is." Richard had been pushing the HOA board for months about his community enhancement project. He wanted to build a small private airport on the edge of the development. Nothing fancy, just a landing strip and a few hangars where residents could keep their personal planes. It would be exclusive, expensive, and exactly the kind of amenity that would attract even wealthier buyers to Millbrook Estates. The problem was, they needed more land. Richard had done his research, and Frank's 47 acres were perfect. The land was mostly flat. It was right next to the development, and best of all, it was owned by one old man who never seemed to care about property values or community standards. But now Frank was gone, and some city girl owned it instead. Richard smiled to himself. This might actually be easier than dealing with stubborn old Frank. Meanwhile, Lisa was discovering just how much work the property needed. The house had good bones, but everything needed updating. The plumbing made concerning noises. The electrical system looked like a fire hazard, and don't even get her started on the kitchen. She started making mental calculations. Renovation costs, property taxes, maintenance, utilities for such a big place. By the time she drove back to Phoenix that evening, Lisa was overwhelmed. She loved the idea of owning land, but the reality was daunting. She made good money as an accountant, but not renovate an entire farm money. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe she should just sell and walk away with whatever cash she could get. Over the next few weeks, Lisa found herself thinking about the farm constantly. She'd grown up in apartments and condos, always dreaming of having space and privacy. The creek, the oak trees, the view of the mountains. It was everything she'd ever wanted but never thought she could afford. She started researching renovation costs and farm restoration. Maybe she could do some of the work herself on weekends. Maybe she could rent out part of the land to help with expenses. Maybe she could make this work. What Lisa didn't know was that Richard had already started making phone calls. He'd contacted the county planning office asking about zoning laws and development permits. He'd spoken with his lawyer about the best way to approach negotiations with the new property owner. He'd even had a surveyor quietly map out the best location for his airport project. Richard was used to getting what he wanted. As HOA president, he'd successfully forced out 3 families who didn't maintain their properties to his standards. He'd blocked 2 different businesses from opening nearby because they didn't fit the community character. He was very good at finding ways to make people do what he wanted them to do, and right now, he wanted Lisa Rodriguez's farm. The stage was set for a battle that would change both their lives forever. Lisa just wanted to honor her great-uncle's memory, and maybe build something beautiful on the land he'd loved. Richard wanted to expand his influence and create the exclusive airport that would cement his legacy as the man who made Millbrook Estates the most prestigious community in the county. Neither of them knew that buried in the county records was a document that would make their conflict about much more than just money or property values. But that discovery was still months away, and first Richard would make his move. 6 months after inheriting the farm, Lisa had fallen into a routine. Every Saturday morning, she'd make the 3-hour drive from Phoenix to work on the property. She'd managed to fix the worst of the plumbing problems and had started painting the farmhouse room by room. It wasn't much, but it was progress. That particular Saturday started like any other. Lisa loaded her car with paint supplies and sandwiches, put on her favorite playlist, and headed out early to beat the traffic. She was actually excited. She'd finally saved enough money to start working on the barn roof. But as she turned down the familiar dirt road leading to her property, something was very wrong. There were vehicles everywhere. Big yellow bulldozers, dump trucks, and a whole crew of construction workers in hard hats. Lisa's heart started pounding as she pulled up to what used to be the quiet corner of her land. A man in a reflective vest walked up to her car window. "Ma'am, you can't park here. This is a construction zone." Lisa stared at him in disbelief. "Construction zone? This is my property." The man looked confused and called over his supervisor, a heavy-set guy with a clipboard who seemed to be in charge. "What's the problem here?" "This lady says this is her property," the first worker explained. The supervisor looked at Lisa with the kind of expression people use when they think you're not very bright. "Ma'am, this is a permitted construction site for the Millbrook Estates Community Airport project. I've got all the paperwork right here." Lisa felt like the world was spinning. "Airport? What airport? This is my farm. I inherited it from my great-uncle, Frank Rodriguez." The supervisor flipped through his clipboard and pulled out a stack of official-looking documents. According to these permits, the Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association has development rights to this section of land for community improvement purposes. The project was approved by the County Planning Commission 3 months ago. Lisa grabbed the papers with shaking hands. The legal language was confusing, but she could see her property address clearly listed. There were stamps and signatures that made everything look official. But how is this possible? She'd never sold anything to anyone. "There has to be some mistake," Lisa said, her voice getting louder. "Nobody asked me about any airport. I never signed anything." The supervisor shrugged. "Lady, I just build what they tell me to build. You'll have to take this up with the HOA. My job is to clear this land and pour the foundation for the terminal building." As if summoned by their conversation, a black Mercedes pulled up and Richard Blackwood stepped out. He was wearing pressed khakis and a golf shirt. looking like he was heading to a country club rather than a construction site. "Is there a problem here?" Richard asked in the smooth voice of someone who was used to being in charge. "This woman claims to own this land," the supervisor explained. Richard turned to Lisa with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, you must be Ms. Rodriguez. I'm Richard Blackwood, president of the Millbrook Estates HOA. I was hoping we'd have a chance to meet under better circumstances." "Better circumstances?" Lisa could barely control her anger. "You're destroying my property." "What gives you the right?" Richard pulled out his own folder of documents, even thicker than the supervisor's. "Ms. Rodriguez, I understand this might be surprising, but everything we're doing here is completely legal. The county determined that your great-uncle's property contained an abandoned municipal easement that reverted to community use after his death." Lisa had no idea what half those words meant. But she knew something was very wrong. My uncle never abandoned anything. "This farm has been in my family since the 1940s. "I'm sure it seems that way," Richard said in a condescending tone. "But legal ownership can be quite complicated. The important thing is that we followed all proper legal channels. We filed with the county, went through the environmental review process, and obtained all necessary permits. The development is already funded, and we have contracts with our construction teams." Lisa looked around at the destruction. In just one morning, they'd cleared about 5 acres of her land. The old apple orchard that her great-uncle had loved was completely gone, replaced by churned-up dirt and surveyor's stakes. Heavy machinery was digging up the pasture where she'd planned to maybe keep horses someday. "You can't just do this," Lisa said. But even as she said it, she realized how helpless she sounded. Richard's expression softened just enough to seem sympathetic, while remaining completely fake. "Ms. Rodriguez, I understand you're upset. Change is never easy. But this airport project will bring significant economic benefits to the entire area. Property values will increase, will create jobs, and the community will have access to a valuable amenity." "I don't care about your amenity. This is my land." "Well, technically, it's more complicated than that," Richard replied. "But I tell you what, we're reasonable people here. The HOA is prepared to offer you compensation for any inconvenience this might cause. We could discuss a fair payment that would help you relocate somewhere more suitable for your needs." Lisa realized what was happening. This wasn't some bureaucratic mistake or legal confusion. Richard and his HOA were trying to steal her land, and they were using official-looking paperwork to make it seem legitimate. "I'm not selling, and I'm not relocating," Lisa said firmly. "This is my property, and you need to stop what you're doing right now." Richard's fake smile disappeared. "Ms. Rodriguez, I strongly advise you to consult with a lawyer before making any hasty decisions. As I said, we have all the proper legal documentation. Fighting this will only cost you money you probably don't have, and in the end, the development will proceed anyway." With that threat hanging in the air, Richard got back in his Mercedes and drove away, leaving Lisa standing in the wreckage of her family's farm. Over the next week, Lisa barely slept. She called the county planning office, but they just repeated what Richard had told her. The HOA had filed all the proper paperwork, and the project had been approved. She tried calling the sheriff's department, but they said it was a civil matter and she'd have to handle it through the courts. Lisa had never needed a lawyer before, and she quickly discovered how expensive they could be. The first 3 attorneys she called wanted retainers of $5,000 or more, just to review her case. She didn't have that kind of money. Meanwhile, the construction continued every day. Lisa would drive out after work and on weekends, watching helplessly as more of her property was destroyed. They were working fast, clearly trying to get as much done as possible before anyone could stop them. The worst part was watching them tear down the old barn. Lisa had been planning to restore it, maybe use it for storage or as a workshop. Instead, she watched a bulldozer knock it down in about 10 minutes, pushing the old wood and metal into a pile that would be hauled away like garbage. By the end of the month, they'd cleared nearly half her property and had started pouring concrete for what Richard called the terminal building. It was just a small structure, but seeing that permanent foundation made Lisa realize how serious this was. They weren't just clearing land anymore. They were building something that would be very expensive to tear down. Lisa felt like she was living in a nightmare. Every morning she'd wake up hoping it had all been a bad dream, but then she'd remember the destruction happening on her family's land. She started having trouble concentrating at work, and her boss noticed that her normally perfect accounting work was starting to slip. The stress was affecting every part of her life. She'd lost weight, she wasn't sleeping, and she'd stopped talking to most of her friends because she was embarrassed about the situation. How do you explain to people that someone is stealing your farm and you can't afford to stop them? But Lisa wasn't ready to give up. Somewhere in her mind, she kept hearing her grandmother's stories about Uncle Frank and how proud he'd been of that land. He'd worked that farm for over 40 years, and now it was being turned into a playground for rich people who thought they could take whatever they wanted. Lisa knew she needed help, but she didn't know where to find it. What she didn't know was that help was about to come from an unexpected source, and that Richard Blackwood had made one crucial mistake that would eventually cost him everything. Lisa was sitting in her car outside the construction site, watching another piece of her family's history get bulldozed when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Lisa Rodriguez?" The voice was young, maybe mid-20s, with a slight accent she couldn't place. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Tony Chen. I'm an attorney here in Phoenix. I heard about what's happening to your property and I'd like to help." Lisa almost hung up. After weeks of lawyers telling her they needed thousands of dollars up front, she was tired of getting her hopes up. "Look, I can't afford the kind of retainer everyone wants. I'm just an accountant, not some rich person. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm not calling to ask for money. I'm calling because what's happening to you is wrong and I think we can prove it." Something in his tone made Lisa pause. "What do you mean?" "I've been following this case through some contacts at the county office. A friend of mine works in the planning department and she mentioned your situation. The more I looked into it, the more suspicious the whole thing seemed." Lisa felt a tiny spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "Suspicious how?" "Well, for starters, the legal description of your property in the HOA's paperwork doesn't match the county's official records. It's off by almost 300 feet in 2 directions. Lisa didn't understand what that meant, but it sounded important. "So what does that mean exactly?" "It means they might be claiming rights to land they don't actually have legal access to." "Can we meet somewhere? I'd like to show you what I've found." The next day, Lisa met Tony at a small coffee shop near the courthouse. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his late 20s, with tired eyes that suggested he'd been staying up late working on her case. He spread several documents across their table like he was solving a puzzle. "Okay, here's what I've discovered so far," Tony said, pointing to a map. "This is the official county survey of your property, from when your great-uncle bought it in 1962. And this," he slid another paper across the table, "is the property description in the HOA's development application." Lisa studied both documents, but they looked like meaningless numbers and measurements to her. "I don't understand the difference." "Look at this corner marker here," Tony pointed to a spot on both maps. "According to the county records, your property line runs along this old fence line and ends at the big oak tree near the creek. But the HOA's paperwork claims the property extends about 300 feet past that oak tree." Lisa thought about the oak tree. She knew exactly which one he meant. It was massive, probably 100 years old, and she'd been planning to build a bench under it. "So they're claiming land that isn't even mine?" "That's one possibility. But here's where it gets really interesting." Tony pulled out another document. "The HOA is claiming that the extra land is part of something called an abandoned municipal easement that gives them development rights." "Yeah, Richard mentioned that." "What's an easement?" "An easement is basically a legal right to use someone else's land for a specific purpose. Like if the power company needs to run lines across your property, they might have an easement to do that." Lisa was starting to understand. "So they're saying the county or city had some kind of right to use part of my land and now they can use it instead?" "Exactly. But here's the problem. I've searched through every municipal record going back to 1940, and there's no record of any easement ever being granted on your property. Not for utilities, not for roads, not for anything." Lisa felt her heart racing. "So they're lying?" "Well, lying is a strong word legally speaking, but their entire case is based on an easement that doesn't seem to exist." Tony leaned back in his chair. "The question is, how did they get the county to approve their development application based on non-existent documentation?" Over the next hour, Tony explained what he thought had happened. Someone had created fake documents that made it look like there was an old municipal easement on Lisa's property. They'd probably used those fake documents to convince the county planning office that the HOA had legitimate development rights. The good news is, If I'm right about this, then everything they're doing is completely illegal, Tony said. The bad news is, proving it is going to take time and money. Lisa's hope started to fade again. How much money? That's where I have a proposition for you. I'm willing to take this case on contingency. What does that mean? It means I don't get paid unless we win. If we lose, you don't owe me anything. If we win, I take a percentage of whatever settlement or judgment we get. Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why would you do that? Tony was quiet for a moment, then said, Because I grew up on a small farm outside Tucson. When I was 15, a big development company pulled something similar on my family. We couldn't afford to fight them, so we lost everything. He gathered up the papers. I became a lawyer so that wouldn't happen to other people. Lisa felt tears in her eyes. After weeks of feeling completely alone, someone was finally willing to help her fight back. But Tony was honest about the challenges they faced. The HOA had already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on construction, and they wouldn't give up easily. Richard Blackwood had hired one of the most expensive law firms in the state, and they would use every legal trick they could think of to drag out the case. The first thing we need to do is file for an emergency injunction to stop the construction, Tony explained. But I have to warn you, that's going to make them very angry and they're going to fight back hard. Lisa thought about the apple orchard that was already gone and the barn that had been demolished. They've already destroyed so much. I can't let them finish. The next week, Tony filed their emergency motion in county court. The legal papers accused the HOA of fraud, trespassing, and destruction of private property. They demanded that all construction stop immediately until the property ownership issues could be resolved. Richard Blackwood's response was swift and brutal. Within hours of the filing, Lisa received a registered letter from the HOA's attorneys. They were threatening to sue her for interfering with a legitimate development project. They claimed she was causing financial harm to the entire Millbrook Estates community, and they wanted damages of over $2 million. Lisa called Tony in a panic. They're saying I owe them $2 million. Can they do that? It's a scare tactic, Tony said calmly. They're trying to frighten you into dropping the case. But here's what they don't know. I've been doing more research, and I think their fake easement problem is even bigger than we thought. Tony had discovered that the surveyor who prepared the HOA's property description had been involved in several other suspicious cases over the past few years. In each case, he'd somehow found easements or property rights that allowed developers to build in places where they shouldn't have been able to. I think this is part of a pattern, Tony explained. Richard and his associates might have been pulling this scam for years, targeting property owners who can't afford to fight back. The implications were huge. If they could prove that Richard had been systematically defrauding property owners, it would be a major criminal case, not just a civil lawsuit. But proving it would require expert witnesses, private investigators, and potentially years of litigation. Lisa was committed to the fight, but she worried about what it would cost Tony if they lost. Are you sure about the contingency arrangement? She asked. What if this ruins your practice? Tony smiled for the first time since she'd met him. Ms. Rodriguez, sometimes you have to take a stand for what's right, even if it's risky. Besides, I have a feeling we're going to uncover something that will make this case a lot bigger than either of us expected. What neither Lisa nor Tony knew was that their investigation was about to reveal a legal document that would change everything. Hidden in the state archives was a piece of paper that would prove the HOA's airport wasn't just built on lies. It was built on land that was legally protected from development forever. But that discovery was still weeks away, and first they had to survive Richard Blackwood's attempts to destroy them both. 3 weeks into their legal battle, Lisa and Tony were losing badly. Richard Blackwood's expensive lawyers had managed to delay the emergency injunction hearing twice, and construction on the airport was moving forward at an even faster pace. Every day Lisa drove out to the property, more of her family's farm was being paved over. Tony was working 18-hour days, but he was running into roadblocks everywhere. The county officials who had approved the HOA's development permits were suddenly unavailable for interviews. Key documents kept getting misfiled or temporarily lost. Even the surveyor who had prepared the fraudulent property description had mysteriously left town on an extended vacation. They're circling the wagons, Tony explained to Lisa over coffee one morning. Everyone who was involved in approving this project is scared they're going to get in trouble, so they're not cooperating with our investigation. Lisa looked exhausted. She'd lost 15 pounds in the past month, and her boss at the accounting firm had started making comments about her performance at work. Maybe we should just give up. Accept whatever settlement they're offering and try to move on. How much are they offering? $50,000 for the whole property. Richard says it's generous considering all the legal trouble I'm causing. Tony nearly choked on his coffee. $50,000? Lisa, your land is worth at least 10 times that, probably more. And that's before you factor in the damage they've caused. But Lisa was starting to lose hope. Fighting felt impossible when the other side had unlimited money and connections throughout the local government. She'd started having nightmares about losing everything and ending up bankrupt from legal fees. Tony could see his client was close to breaking. He'd been in this situation before. Regular people trying to fight powerful interests who had every advantage. Usually the little guy gave up right about now. Lisa, I want to try one more thing before we consider any settlement. Give me 3 more days. What are you going to do in 3 days that you haven't already tried? I want to go back through every piece of paper related to your property, starting from when your great-uncle first bought it. Sometimes the answer is hiding in plain sight. Tony spent the weekend at the State Archives building in Phoenix, a dusty place where old government documents went to be forgotten. He'd already searched through the county records, but the state kept older files that sometimes didn't make it into the local databases. He started with 1962, when Frank Rodriguez had first bought the farm. The purchase documents were straightforward. Frank had bought 47 acres from a farmer named William Henderson for $8,000. Nothing unusual there. But Tony decided to go back further, tracing the ownership history of the land all the way back to the 1940s. Most of it was boring paperwork, but he wanted to be thorough. That's when he found something that made him stop breathing for a moment. In 1952, the state of Arizona had granted something called perpetual agricultural preservation rights to the property. Tony had never heard of such a thing, but the language in the document was very clear. The state was guaranteeing that the land would remain available for farming forever, protected from any development that would interfere with agricultural use. The document had been signed by the governor himself and filed with both the state and federal governments. It was part of a program designed to prevent good farmland from being lost to urban development. Once these rights were granted, they could never be revoked or superseded by local zoning laws. Tony's hands were shaking as he read the document 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. If this was legitimate, it meant that building an airport on Lisa's property wasn't just fraud. It was a violation of state and federal agricultural protection laws. He immediately called Lisa. I need you to meet me at the archives building right now. Tony, it's Sunday afternoon. What's so urgent? I found something that changes everything. Lisa drove to Phoenix faster than she'd ever driven before. When she arrived at the archives building, Tony was waiting for her with a huge grin on his face and a folder full of documents. Lisa, your great-uncle never owned the mineral rights to this property, Tony said excitedly. Okay, what does that mean? It means he was smart enough to keep something even more valuable. Look at this. Tony showed her the agricultural preservation rights document from 1952. As he explained what it meant, Lisa felt a mixture of excitement and disbelief. So you're saying this land can never be developed? Ever? Not just never developed. It's specifically protected from any use that would interfere with farming operations. An airport definitely qualifies as interfering with farming operations. Lisa studied the document. Her great-uncle's name was right there, clear as day. Frank Rodriguez had signed an agreement with the state that would protect his farm forever, even after his death. But why didn't anyone know about this? Shouldn't it have come up when the county was reviewing the HOA's application? Tony shook his head. That's the problem with government bureaucracy. This document should have been cross-referenced in the county database, but it was filed in a different department. It got lost in the system for 70 years. As they dug deeper into the archives, they found even more evidence that supported their case. The Agricultural Preservation Program had been created specifically to prevent exactly what Richard Blackwood was trying to do. Wealthy developers taking over family farms for luxury projects. There's something else, Tony said, pulling out another document. These agricultural preservation rights aren't just a state issue. They're backed by federal law. That means Richard and his HOA haven't just violated local property law, they've violated federal agricultural protection statutes. Lisa was trying to process everything. What does that mean for our case? It means we don't just have grounds for a civil lawsuit anymore. This could be a federal criminal case. The penalties for violating federal agricultural protection laws include serious fines and potential jail time. Tony was already planning their next moves. They would file an amended lawsuit that included the agricultural preservation rights. They would also contact the Federal Department of Agriculture and the FBI about potential criminal violations. But here's the best part, Tony said with a smile. Richard and his lawyers have no idea this document exists. They've been building their entire case on the assumption that they had legitimate development rights. When we spring this on them, they're going to realize they've built a multi-million-dollar airport on land that was legally protected from development. Lisa felt a surge of energy she hadn't experienced in weeks. After being pushed around and intimidated, she finally had real ammunition to fight back. What happens now? Now we go on the offensive. First thing tomorrow morning, I'm filing for another emergency injunction, but this time with the agricultural preservation rights as evidence. No judge in the country is going to allow construction to continue on federally protected farmland. That night, Lisa drove out to her property one more time before everything changed. The construction site was empty, with security lights illuminating the partially completed airport terminal. Heavy machinery sat silent, ready to continue the destruction in the morning. But as Lisa stood there looking at what had been done to her family's land, she wasn't feeling defeated anymore. She was feeling angry. Richard Blackwood had stolen her property using fake documents and corrupt officials. He'd destroyed her great-uncle's apple orchard and torn down a barn that had stood for 60 years. Tomorrow, she was going to start fighting back with weapons he never knew existed. Lisa pulled out her phone and called Tony. I want you to file the biggest lawsuit possible. I want them to pay for every tree they cut down, every foot of soil they moved, and every lie they told. Are you sure? Once we file this, there's no going back. They're going to come after us with everything they have. Lisa looked at the construction lights one more time. Let them come. My great-uncle protected this land for the future, and I'm not going to let some greedy HOA president destroy it for his vanity project. The next morning, Tony would file a lawsuit that would make headlines across the state. But tonight, Lisa stood on her family's farm and made a promise to her great-uncle Frank that she would restore every acre to the farmland he'd always intended it to be. Monday morning arrived like a thunderstorm. Tony was at the courthouse when it opened, filing their amended lawsuit with the agricultural preservation rights as the centerpiece. Within an hour, he'd also submitted formal complaints to the FBI, the Department of Agriculture, and the State Attorney General's office. Lisa was at work when Tony called with an update that made her nearly fall out of her chair. The judge granted our emergency injunction. All construction has to stop immediately. Seriously? Just like that? Just like that. When Judge Martinez saw the agricultural preservation documents, her exact words were, "How in the hell did the county approve development on federally protected farmland?" She's ordered a full investigation into everyone who was involved in approving the airport project. Within hours, sheriff's deputies were at the construction site, ordering all the workers to pack up their equipment and leave. Lisa drove out there during her lunch break and watched with satisfaction as the bulldozers were loaded onto trailers and hauled away. But Richard Blackwood wasn't giving up without a fight. That afternoon, his lawyers filed an emergency appeal, claiming that the agricultural preservation rights were too old to be enforceable. They argued that 70 years of changed circumstances had essentially nullified the original agreement. It's a desperate move, Tony explained to Lisa, but they're going to try everything they can think of. What Richard didn't know was that Tony had been busy building a much larger case. The young lawyer had contacted 3 other property owners who'd had similar problems with suspicious development projects over the past 5 years. In each case, the same surveyor had been involved, and the same county officials had approved questionable permits. The FBI took notice. Within a week, federal agents were interviewing everyone connected to the airport project. The corrupt surveyor was arrested trying to board a plane to Mexico. 2 county planning officials suddenly resigned and hired criminal defense attorneys. Richard Blackwood, meanwhile, was discovering that building an illegal airport was expensive in more ways than one. The HOA's insurance company was refusing to cover the construction costs, claiming that fraud wasn't covered under their policy. Several residents of Millbrook Estates were threatening to sue the HOA board personally for wasting their money on an illegal project. The pressure was building from all directions, but Richard still thought he could find a way out. He contacted Lisa directly, offering her $1 million to settle the case quietly. "Tell him I'm not interested," Lisa told Tony. "I want him to face the consequences of what he did." "Are you sure? $1 million would set you up for life." Lisa thought about her great-uncle Frank and how hard he'd worked to protect the farm. "This isn't about money anymore. It's about making sure nobody can do this to anyone else." 3 months later, the criminal case went to trial. Lisa testified about watching her family's apple orchard get bulldozed while county officials ignored her complaints. Tony presented evidence showing a pattern of corruption that had been going on for years. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecution played secretly recorded phone calls between Richard and the corrupt surveyor. In one conversation, Richard clearly knew that the agricultural preservation rights existed, but told the surveyor to bury that information so deep that nobody will ever find it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Richard Blackwood was convicted on federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and violating agricultural protection laws. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $3 million in restitution. 2 county officials were also convicted and sentenced to prison time. The corrupt surveyor pleaded guilty and received 5 years in federal prison, but the criminal case was just the beginning. Lisa's civil lawsuit against the HOA was even more devastating. Tony had calculated damages that included not just the cost of restoring the property, but also the lost agricultural value over the expected lifetime of the farm. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue that the damages were excessive, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. The defendants knowingly destroyed federally protected farmland for their own benefit, Judge Martinez said during the sentencing hearing. The damages should reflect not just the cost of repair, but the severity of their crimes. The final settlement was $8.2 million. The money came from the HOA's insurance company, the personal assets of the board members who had approved the project, and the forced sale of several luxury homes in Millbrook Estates. Lisa used the first $1 million to hire a restoration company that specialized in agricultural land recovery. It took 8 months, but they managed to remove every trace of the airport construction. The concrete was broken up and hauled away. The soil was tested and treated, and new topsoil was brought in to replace what had been contaminated. The most emotional moment came when Lisa planted new apple trees where her great-uncle's orchard had been destroyed. She chose heritage varieties that would have been familiar to Frank, and she planted them in the exact same pattern as the original orchard. With the remaining settlement money, Lisa established the Rodriguez Agricultural Defense Fund, which provides free legal services to family farmers who are facing pressure from developers or corrupt local officials. Tony became the fund's first full-time attorney. "We want to make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else," Tony said at the fund's opening ceremony. The case had national implications. Congress passed new legislation strengthening federal agricultural protection laws and requiring better coordination between local and federal agencies. The Rodriguez case, as it became known, was cited in law schools as an example of how ordinary citizens could fight back against corruption and win. Richard Blackwood's downfall was complete. He lost his house, his cars, and his reputation. The Millbrook Estates HOA was dissolved, and several of its board members also faced personal bankruptcy. The exclusive community that Richard had worked so hard to build became a cautionary tale about what happens when people think they can take whatever they want. Lisa kept her job as an accountant but now split her time between Phoenix and the farm. She restored the old farmhouse exactly as her great-uncle had kept it, and she started raising organic vegetables that she sold at the local farmers market. On quiet Sunday afternoons, Lisa would sit under the big oak tree that marked her property line and think about how different her life had become. A year earlier, she'd been a city girl who knew nothing about farming or legal battles. Now she owned a beautiful farm, had helped send corrupt officials to prison, and was protecting other families from the same kind of abuse she'd suffered. The best part was the letters she received from other farmers around the country who'd heard about her case. Many of them had been dealing with similar pressure from developers, but they'd felt helpless to fight back. Now they knew it was possible to win. Lisa always ended her responses to these letters the same way. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it seems impossible. The land is worth fighting for, and justice is possible if you're willing to work for it. Every morning when Lisa drove onto her property, she passed the spot where Richard's airport terminal was supposed to have been built. Instead, there was a small sign that read, "Rodriguez Farm, Eastern 1962, protected forever." Her great-uncle Frank would have been proud.